Welcome to part 2 of lesson 6 in the American Studies Listening Encounters textbook. In this part of the lesson, we'll be focusing especially on laws in America, focused on stopping discrimination against old people and those that have disabilities. Look at these pictures. What can you see in the pictures? What problems do you think that people might face? And what laws could help each of these people to participate in society? Pause the recording now while you think about that. Well, let's start with the first picture, the woodworker picture. You can see from this man that he's quite old. In many countries, there are laws to stop discrimination against old people. Sometimes old people can struggle to find new jobs. Employers might want to take on young people. Sometimes young people will work for lower salaries. And so there are many rules in countries that stop employers discriminating against old people. In my country, men can stop working when they're 67, but there are laws to make sure that employers will give jobs to old people up until that age of 67. It's only when they get past that age that the government will support them with a pension, with money every week, so that they don't need to work anymore. Maybe it's different to Myanmar. In Myanmar, families would have many children, and those children would take care of their parents when they get old. But in many Western countries, the government will take care of the people when they get old, because the whole time that they're working, they're paying taxes and something called national insurance. And that national insurance gives them a guaranteed income until they die. Let's look at the second picture. You might notice that this lady in the middle is also quite old. And that's something that you'll find in developed countries. Older people sometimes go back to school. Maybe they want to learn a new skill so that they can get a different job. I think of in my family, my father's wife. She graduated from university when she was about 40, 45, I think. And after that, she became a teacher. And she worked as a teacher for the next 15 years. She could do that because there is support in Western countries to help older people go back to school or college or even university. What do you notice about the athlete? You might see that this leg here is a false leg. And in many countries, there are different categories of sport. Sports for those that are able-bodied and also sport for those that have disabilities. They might compete in different categories, but there is professional sport for those that have disabilities. And if you watch the Olympics on TV, you'll see that there's the Olympic Games for those that are fully able and Olympic Games for those that have disabilities. For example, maybe soldiers may have fought in the war and lost a leg or an arm. There'll be special categories of sport that they can join and compete with other people that have similar disabilities. And then look at the office worker. The office worker is in a wheelchair. And many countries have laws that state employers need to find ways to help those people that have disabilities participate in the workplace. There'll be rules about not having steps, about having a ramp so that a wheelchair can go up the ramp. There'll be rules about different disabilities, about those people that have trouble seeing or trouble hearing. And so the human resources department, the department of a company that deals with the employees, needs to take into consideration all of the different needs of the people that work in the company. When you're listening to a lecture, and in fact when you go to university, you'll often hear signal words and phrases. And these signal words and phrases help the listener to understand what part of the lesson or the subject the teacher is talking about and how the ideas link together. You'll know some of these words already, things like first, second, last. These add extra information or extra ideas. You might also know also or in addition. Again, these add new ideas. However, in contrast, these show differences, or like or similar to. They show similarity. When you were studying about narrative writing, you might have looked at words like before and after, while and during that show the order of things that are happening. Pause the recording now and have a look through this list and understand the reason that each of these words might be used. If there are any words that you don't know, this might be a time to write them down so that you can try to use them in your academic writing. Now, you're going to hear a recording in a few minutes, but before you listen to the recording, look at these different sentences and try to complete the gaps with words from the box on the previous slide. If you've finished guessing, you're now going to hear the recording. Check to see if your answers are correct. Sometimes there might be more than one correct answer, but because this is a listening activity, you need to make sure that the answer matches the answer on the recording.
Chapter 6. The Struggle Continues. Page 91. Note-taking. Listening for signal words and phrases. Step 2. 1.
Now, to refresh your memory, the 60s was an important decade because during this time, several important laws gave more rights to women, African Americans, and immigrants.
2.
Let's begin with the first one, the Age Discrimination Act. I think we need to talk about first the reasons why this law was needed, second, what it does, and third, its impact.
3.
Before this law, employers could set an age limit for job applicants.
4.
Well, of course, it refers to hiring and firing. In other words, age can't be used as a reason for refusing to hire an older person.
5.
In addition, age can't be used as a reason to promote someone to a better position.
6.
The ADA also covers people who face discrimination because they have a serious illness like cancer.
7.
And as for non-physical disabilities, did you know that some businesses are actually starting to hire some people with mental disabilities if they are capable of doing a particular job?
8.
But I think the most important impact of this law is that it's helped to change the way we think.
9.
In many places in the world, people with disabilities have to stay at home because there is no way for them to get around.
Now complete the steps in your book.
Let's look at the answers together. For number 1, the answer was to refresh your memory. This is used when the lecturer or the person speaking wants to remind you of something that they've already said, maybe previously in the lesson or in something that was said on a previous day. For number 2, they're adding ideas. So the first gap is first. You might also see second. And the last gap is third. For number 3, the answer is before. And this is showing that the time order. Before this law, employers could set an age limit for job applicants, so they could limit the maximum age of the person applying for the job. For number 4, the answer is in other words. In other words mean that they will say the same thing, but they will use different words. This might help you to understand the idea more clearly. Number 5, this should be familiar to you. It is in addition. Number 6, we have also, to show an extra idea. And then we have because, and because shows the reason why something is happening. Number 7, we have as for. And then number 8, we have the most. The last one, again, we have because to show the reason. Before we go to the next activity, try to guess what these words mean. There are 8 different words and 8 different explanations. Try to match the word and the explanation. Pause the recording now. So for number 1, we're talking about the reason why the law was needed and what it does, and the impact. Well, the impact is the effect or the result. So number 1, the answer is B. For number 2, before this law, employers could set an age limit for job applicants. Setting is going to be a verb, and another word for set is to make. So the correct answer is D. Number 3, age can't be used as a reason to promote someone to a better position. Promote means to move to a higher level, to move to a higher position in the workplace. Maybe you go from a teacher to a senior teacher or to a deputy head teacher. This is the idea of promotion. Number 4, the benefits. You should know that benefit means advantage. So the correct answer is F. Retiring means stopping work. And in the West, you normally stop work when you are old. So the correct answer is A. If something is mandatory, it means that you do not have a choice. You must do something. So we need answer E. And then for number 7, legal complaints. If you complain, you say that something is wrong or not satisfactory, that you are not happy with something. And the last one, more than 40% more likely, means the possibility is at least 40% higher. If you're making notes in class, you might want to try and show the difference between the main idea, the supporting detail, and specific information. Indenting means to move in. So we can see here we have the main idea, and then the first idea is further in, and the details are further in. If you're writing notes, this can help you to organize your thoughts so that you can see what the main ideas are and what the supporting details are. Have a look at this. Read through and try to decide what the main points are, what the subpoints are, and what the supporting details are. You're about to hear a recording. Try to use the recording to see if you are correct. What are the main points? What are the secondary points? And what are the supporting details? You can put an M for the main point, an S for the secondary point, and a D for the detail. I know on this it will be very difficult for you to write, so just write down M, S, and D for each line.
Chapter 6. The Struggle Continues. Page 93. Note-taking. Indenting. Step 2.
Hello, everyone. Now, to refresh your memory, the 60s was an important decade because during this time, several important laws gave more rights to women, African Americans, and immigrants. But today I'll talk about two other groups, the elderly, I mean senior citizens, and the disabled. The laws that I'll talk about specifically are the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Let's begin with the first one, the Age Discrimination Act. I think we need to talk about first the reasons why this law was needed, second, what it does, and third, its impact. So first of all, why did the United States need this law? Well, the law tried to correct several problems, mainly that older people faced a lot of discrimination in the workplace. Before this law, employers could set an age limit for job applicants. For example, they might say that a job was open only to applicants under age 35. The law tries to change the situation. Basically, it protects people over 40 years old from discrimination at work, and it covers a lot of areas. Well, of course, it refers to hiring and firing. In other words, age can't be used as a reason for refusing to hire an older person, and employers cannot fire older people because of their age either. In addition, age can't be used as a reason to promote someone to a better position or give them particular jobs. The impact of this law has been quite significant. If you're applying for a job nowadays, you won't see anything about age on the application. And a second example is that older workers can get the same benefits as younger people, health insurance and so on. Also, in most cases, mandatory retirement is not allowed nowadays. In other words, your company cannot force you to retire. You might ask, do employers actually follow this law? Well, there are still many thousands of legal complaints about age discrimination each year, so we have to be realistic about this. There is still some discrimination against older workers. For example, a recent study showed that companies are more than 40% more likely to interview a younger job applicant than an older job applicant. However, people are definitely more aware of age discrimination than they were before.
Now complete the steps in your book.
These are the answers that I got. At the start of the lecture, the professor says that he's going to speak about two different laws, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act and the Disabilities Act. So I said the Age Discrimination in Employment Act is the main point. He then says we need to think about three different parts: why the law was needed, what the law does, and the impact of the law. So this would be the first point that he wants to talk about, this would be the second point he wants to talk about, and this would be the third point that he wants to talk about. And he did say first here, which would give you a clue that this is going to be a main point. Older people having discrimination in the workplace, and before there being limits, for example, 35 on the age that somebody could apply for a job. These are details about why the law was needed. What does the law do? Well, it protects people over 40 from discrimination. Age cannot be used to refuse to give somebody a job, to fire somebody, or to give somebody a better position. So the main point is what the law does, and then there are 5 details explaining what law does allow and does not allow. The third point he said was the impact of the law. So what is happening because of the law? Nowadays, nothing about age in the job application. If you're applying for a job, it will not say the maximum age. There are equal benefits for older and younger people. And there's no mandatory retirement. There's no age that you must retire. Finally, he said, do employers follow the law? Well, do employers follow the law is different to the impact of the law. So I think this is actually a fourth idea that he adds in. And then he gives 3 examples of employers following or not following the law. You might have slightly different answers, but you should have noticed that why the law was needed, what the law does, and the impact of the law are some of the main topics under the idea of the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. Here we have another vocabulary from context exercise. Pause the recording now and try to match the definitions to the words in the 7 sentences. The first one, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is called the ADA for short. So the ADA. So a short way of saying something is an abbreviation. So you should have chosen answer D. Now, disability, we can mean physical or mental condition. Mental is always about the mind. So a mental condition is a sickness of a mind that will affect people's behavior or emotions. Mechanism, you might think of mechanic. Mechanic is somebody that fixes machines. So you might have got that mechanisms is the idea of technology or gadgets. Get around. Around is talking about moving. So you might have been able to match move from place to place. Rejected. Rejected means not accept. You should know that. For example, if you apply for a scholarship and they reject you, that means you do not get the scholarship. So the correct answer is G. And then shameful. A shameful can be a great embarrassment. You feel ashamed. You don't like what you're feeling. You don't like what you are experiencing. Then the last one is inclusion, coming from the verb to include. If you include people, and you can actually see the word including, that means including everybody or accepting everybody. So now that you've thought about some of these key words, let's go forward. This time, we're going to look at a different system for taking notes. Last time it was based on indentation, and the further indented, the less important the information. This time, we're going to be using something more like bullet points, where you could say A, B, C, or you could write I, Roman numerals, then I. You might want to write a small letter A and a small b and a small c to show that they are the small details. Or 1, 2, 3. You could write 1, 1.1, 1.1.1, 2, 2.1, etc. Honestly, it doesn't really matter how you organize your notes. But the important thing is that when you go to university, you will have to write notes. You have to write down what the teacher tells you. These textbooks were written quite a few years ago, and today many universities, their teachers will publish their PowerPoint presentation on the internet before you go to the class. So you have the opportunity to print out the PowerPoint and then just write notes around the slides. So you might not need to make notes in the same way. But this textbook was written before PowerPoints became very popular. So the method of note-taking will not be the same as it was in the past. However, the most important thing is that you can write notes, and that when you finish your class, maybe you look back at night time or you look back 2 or 3 days later, you can still understand the notes. You can understand what the main points were and what the details and examples were that supported those main points. For me, when I went to university, I would write notes very, very quickly in class, and my handwriting is terrible, and the notes would be very, very short. That night, I would try to write my notes into sentences, so that when I looked back at my notes before the exam a few months later, I would still be able to understand what the notes meant. So that might be a good habit for you to learn as well. When you go to university in the class, write very, very short notes. But when you go home, maybe at night time or the next day, try to go back to your notes and to write them out in full sentences so that you can focus on those main points. Some teachers even give you hints about what will be in the exam. and many teachers will include things from their lectures in the exams. So it's important that you're paying attention and you understand what the teacher thinks are the main points, especially when you have a very thick textbook. Sometimes a textbook can be 1,000 pages long, and not all of the information is equally important. So the teacher will focus on the more important parts of the textbook in class. So you need to make sure that you understand the things that the teacher is saying. Now, have a look at these outline notes. This is the beginning of the lecture. What is the main idea of this part 2? Well, I think we can see the main idea is the title. The main idea of this lecture will be about Americans with Disabilities Act. Remember, an act means a law by Congress. So Congress made a law about Americans that have disabilities. We can see the number 1 here. So it shows that the first main point will be about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then there'll be supporting details. The first one is when it was passed. The second one is who it protects. It protects people with disabilities in different places. And remember, you don't need to write full words. DIFF will mean different. The W with the line means with. PPL would be people. If you can remember what your abbreviations mean, then that means that the abbreviations are working well for you. But that's why when you go home at night time, you might want to write this out in a full sentence. The ADA was passed in 1990 and protects people with disabilities in different places. For example, at work, when they're trying to rent a house, and when they are going for education. Now, have a look at these notes from the lecture. Try to guess what will be the main points and what will be the details. As you go through, you can put an A, B, C, or you could write numbers, number 1, number 1.1, number 1.1.1, however you like. Okay, you will now hear the actual recording. Listen to the recording, and especially to any transition signals, and see if you got the main ideas and you understood which of these points were details.
Note-taking. Using an outline. Step 3.
Now let's turn to the second law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is often called the ADA for short. This law was passed in 1990, and it protects people with disabilities against discrimination in different places, for example, at work, in housing, and in education. By disability, we mean first any physical or mental condition that limits a person's ability to participate in a major life activity like walking, seeing, or hearing. The ADA also covers people who face discrimination because they have a serious illness like cancer, so both physical and mental disabilities. Let me describe the impact of the ADA. This law has changed life for thousands of disabled people across the country. If you've ridden a public bus in an American city, for example, you know that they all have special mechanisms to help people in wheelchairs get on and off the bus. And doorways have to be wide for the same reason, so that people in wheelchairs can easily get in and out of buildings. And as for non-physical disabilities, did you know that some businesses are actually starting to hire some people with mental disabilities if they're capable of doing a particular job? And students with learning difficulties can get help, such as extra time on tests. But I think the most important impact of this law is that it's helped to change the way we think. In many places in the world, people with disabilities have to stay at home because there is no way for them to get around. And they are also often rejected by society. We are beginning to understand that having a disability doesn't mean people can't participate in society. And there are many things people with particular disabilities can do. In 1990, when President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law, he said, let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down. In other words, that the wall that had always separated disabled people from everyone else should disappear. What this means is that our goal needs to be inclusion, equality, and full participation for all people, including people with disabilities.
Now complete the steps in your book.
So let's have a look together. We already saw from the previous activity that the main point of the lesson is the Americans and Disabilities Act of 1990. And the first point was the ADA, when it was passed and who it protected. Then he talks about the definition of disability. So I gave that a number 2. And then he talks about the physical and the mental. So I went 2.1 and 2.2 to show that these two parts are supporting the definition of disability. Then he talked about the impact of the ADA. This is a new point. It's not the definition anymore, it's how it changed people's lives. So I gave that a number 3. It changed life for disabled people. So I gave that 3.1. And then it gave an example. So this would be 3.1.1 because this is an example of how it changed life for disabled people. And the doorways being wide is also an example of changing life for disabled people. So I gave it 3.1.2. Then he started to talk about non-physical or mental disabilities. So that's different from disabled, physical disabilities. So I called this 3.2. And then learning disabilities, you might want to call this 3.3, or you might want to call this 3.2.1, because this is an example. A learning difficulty is an example of a mental disability. The next section was about the important impact of the law. And it said that this changed people's thinking. So because this is a new section, I gave this a new number. And then it talked about the impact in other countries, and it talked about the impact in America. So I gave it a 0.1 and a 0.2 to show that in other countries and in America, these are both supporting the main point of the impact changing people's thinking. And then he gave an example of President Bush. Well, President Bush is from America. So I called this 4.2.1 to show that this is an example of the previous line. The last point he said was that the goal must be inclusion. So you might have said this is number 5, or you might have said this is 4.3. There are many different ideas. And the important thing when you're writing notes is there is no right answer and there is no wrong answer. You just need to be able to write your notes in a way that will help you to remember what was said in the class. Now, this lesson has been focused on laws that countries, and especially America, have made to help include older people in the workforce and to help include disabled people, physically and mentally disabled people. Now, I'd like you to go to the forum on Moodle. So if you go to your Moodle, you'll see the American Listening course and go to Chapter 6. There's a forum page open, and I would like you to write one paragraph about whether you think the government has a duty to protect disabled people and old people in the workplace. You might say yes, or you might say no. I want to hear your ideas. Your ideas might not be the same as a Western person's ideas because you're from Asia, and in Asia there are not the same laws that there are in America and Europe. So there's no right answer and there's no wrong answer. But whatever you say, I want to hear your reasons. So try to write a paragraph, maybe 150 words. When you finish your paragraph, look at what other people have said and give comment to each other. You might want to ask questions. You might want to say why you agree with other people, or you might want to say why you disagree. You have 1 week to complete this activity. That's the end of the recording today. Next week we'll continue into Chapter 7.